I'm Dennis Daly. How would you like to look 30 until you're 50, or is it too late already? I interviewed Dave Johnson, a PhD who wrote the book on looking as young as you can.
I feel personally as a medical school professor that the problem today is that we rely on our physicians to give us information about disease prevention. And the reality is, in America, you see your physician an average of 15 minutes a year. And this is a physician who's largely untrained in preventative medicine. And we spend all of our time teaching our physicians to detect and treat existing disease. So the mistake most of us make is we think that if there's no information being given to us, then there's no information available. And in fact, there's a lot of information available.
Yeah, I had a doctor one time who said that for the most part, he was always playing catch-up.
Right.
His job as a physician was to stop the spread or advance or whatever of what was happening and then work his way back from there.
That's right, and that's what he was trained to do. And there's a role for that in medicine, treating existing disease, catching it early, etc. But the fact of the matter is, what the book is about is age-related disease, and those types of diseases are not curable. Mm-hmm. So the message I give people a lot of times is that if you're 65 years old, and you wake up and you have chest pains and you go to your doctor and they do an angiogram and they find that you have coronary artery disease. You didn't get coronary artery disease that week. That's the final result of a process that's been going on for 60 years. In fact, when they did the autopsies on the Vietnam vets and the Korean War veterans, boys 18, 19, 20 years old, those men already had the beginnings of coronary artery disease. So it starts in your teens at least.
One of the things that amaze me, and I'm not bragging here, I'm thankful the fact that I'm a non-smoker. I'm a violent non-smoker. I'm a non-drinker. Probably drink too much caffeine, too much aspartame, and don't get enough exercise. But I've almost cut out all fat altogether because I can't digest anything anymore. But about 7 or 8 years ago, I was in Colorado with 15 or 20 other guys. We were hiking. And I looked down, and there are 3 or 4 guys in their 20s down there, huffing and puffing. And here I am, almost 50 at the time. And I'm up there, and sure, I'm winded, and I'm a little lightheaded because there's a lack of air. And I found out later those guys smoked. And it never occurred to me how, no matter how young they were, they had so messed up their lungs at that time that I was a mile ahead of them. I mean, you must, as a person in your position, realize much more than the layman how all of those other influences can really drag a person down.
Smoking probably cancels out everything that you can do for yourself that's healthy and in a preventative nature especially. If you smoke and you do all the things in my book or in other books or from information that you've gotten elsewhere, if you smoke, you can be canceling all those things out. There seems to be no question about that. And that's why all you have to do is look at clinical studies. When we do clinical studies of diseases, unless we're looking at diseases that are due to smoking, we never include smokers. Those people are eliminated because they're going to confound the results because they're almost certainly going to have disease.
It's funny, this has nothing to do with that, but there's a parallel to that. Whenever they do the statistics on airline accidents and fatalities, they never include Alaska. I don't know whether you knew that or not. There's so many private pilots, but the weather is so bad, and there's so many accidents up there, it would skew the curve. So they take Alaska out of the... So never fly to Alaska. I guess that's the bottom line.
Could be my next book, Alaskan Plane Crashes.
Alaskan Plane Crashes, which is not a very funny topic when you think about it. Let's take a break here. I'm Dennis Daly. You and I get together every weekend at this time. We are talking to Dave Johnson, who's written a wonderful new book about staying 30 and looking 30 until we're 50. But unfortunately, for those of us who have already passed 50, it's a little late to read the book. Maybe not. There are some wonderful common sense things here about health and fitness and things we really need to learn about because none of us is getting any younger. What is your feeling about the success of trying to stop? What would you say to people? I mean, I've had friends who've been able to go cold turkey. I've had friends who know that they're killing themselves. They have that, they can't carry on a conversation without wheezing. And to look at them, they just ache to be able to stop smoking. It must be a terrible monkey on your back.
Well, my feeling about smoking, as I've known several people that have died from smoking, and I know a lot about the physiology of smoking, and that's that, to me, it's almost unbelievable that it's legal. Where I look at the money, I used to be in addiction medicine, and I look at the money that we spend in this country going after drug traffickers, etc., that bring in cocaine and heroin into this country. And if you look at the statistics from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the National Institute of Health, those drugs, the problems, at least the health problems, not looking at the social issues, but the health problems alone, from cocaine and all the illegal drugs combined, don't even come close to the problems associated with smoking and health. And yet smoking's legal. And I say to people, I remember a thing I heard when I used to do addiction medicine, was that the cigarette companies say, well, people choose to smoke, so they should have a choice. And my answer to that is, having been involved in addiction medicine, is you choose to smoke when you first start. It isn't long after that you don't choose anymore. You have to continue smoking because now you're addicted, and everybody that smokes knows that's true.
I have a friend who's not quite 30, who about 5 years ago told me that he was going to start smoking a couple of cigarettes or so when he went to a bar just to look in. And I said, Todd, that's the kind of peer group pressure kids 12 years old. So I said, no. I said, I'll make you a bet. Within 2 months, you'll be up to 2 packs a day. Yep. Just aches. It aches inside me to realize that he chose that, thinking that he would have the willpower to not get hooked. It just doesn't work.
And you know what? Another aspect of that, another example, that's a very good example of how people will say, I'm just going to do a little bit of smoking. That's like being a little pregnant when you say, I smoke a little bit, because it is such an addictive substance. I have a brother, to use as another anecdote here. My brother started smoking to lose weight. He started smoking to lose weight, and our father died of a cancer that was related to smoking. And I told him, I remember saying to him, Scott, you start smoking, and you give it about 10 to 20 years, you'll lose some weight, all right. You'll be anorexic from the cancer.
Oh. Let's move on to happier things. A person listening to this who is at the age of 30, or I wish I'd been able to talk to you 21 years ago about this. First of all, what are the mistakes most people make in their middle years that lead to problems when they get older? What false assumptions do they make? What health decisions do they make wrongly at age 30 that really have that big impact on them down the road?
Well, there's several of them that mistakes that we make, but there's certainly a few that are classic ones. And one of the ones that it seems like an old story, but it really isn't because of the information that we have about it that's so conclusive, and that's exercise. We get into this state of mind when we get to be in our 30s. Usually we have family by then. We have jobs that usually take up a lot of our time, and we literally convince ourselves that we don't have time to exercise. And the reality is that your body, when you were running around, or your ancestors were running around here several thousand years ago, we didn't have buses and trains and escalators, etc. And your body is designed to get exercise right up till the day you die. And in the last 50 years, we've gotten to the point where we have, we sit on the couch, we've got the clicker. We basically don't have to move if we don't want to. That's contributed enormously to the increase in disease we see in our population.
I don't know why the average American couch potato doesn't have bed sores. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but you're right. I know one of the reasons I moved to California was to try to get in a little bit better shape where I can walk all year round. I haven't done much of it, but I remember about 10 years ago, I got onto this walking jack. I was doing about 45 minutes a night, very briskly, not loping, not quite jogging, but at a very rapid pace. I felt wonderful. I've just got to get up and start doing that again.
You can't even begin to imagine the benefits that are in exercise. Everybody knows about the connection between exercise and heart disease, but there's so many studies now showing exercise alleviating depression, like you were just saying. You never felt better. And everybody that's been an athlete knows that. When you played sports, even when you were young, after a game or something, that tremendous feeling of euphoria you get from probably the endorphins that are released secondary to exercise. But when you exercise, so many beneficial things are going on in your body. And the good news about exercise is you don't have to be a Boston Marathon runner to get these benefits. We now have so many clinical studies showing that just walking briskly 45 minutes, 30 minutes, 3 times a week has tremendous long-term benefits for us.
Dave, to continue our discussion about aging and tobacco smoke and everything else, have you read many of the studies that they've done about twins lately?
I've read a lot of studies with twins, but I'm not sure which one
There was
you want to talk
one
about.
recently out of Sweden, and it very basically, they found 15 or 20 sets of twins where one had been sedentary and the other one had just walked a lot. The classic thing that started them on this was a study of letter carriers.
I haven't seen that.
And it showed that the one who walked a lot had nearly half the physical problems of the one who didn't, and that they tried to home in on people who really didn't get much exercise other than the walking. And I guess what they were showing, obviously, is that people poo-poo walking as being therapeutic, but if it's done right, it can be very good.
Well, there's no question about that. I'd like to read that study because it just reinforces many other studies that I have read and have on file. And you know, there's actually numbers that we look at, and some of those numbers now, you'll find most exercise physiologists and cardiologists will tell you that you actually only have to get your maximal heart rate up for about 30 minutes, and your maximal heart rate is basically that you can actually calculate your maximal heart rate by subtracting your age from 220. And that gives you an estimate of your maximal heart rate. And if you can get up to 60-70% of that maximal heart rate for only 20 or 30 minutes, you can get tremendous benefits from walking alone. And you can do that through walking very easily.
I was doing the mathematics there as you were saying that. One of the things I have noticed, and I don't know how much you deal in talking about stress, is I had the occasion of stopping by the local grocery one evening before I went on vacation. I was very stressed that day at work. You know, when you leave on vacation, you have to do about 3 weeks' worth of work before you leave. My blood pressure was very elevated. The next morning, I flew to Key West, spent most of the day in the pool and the hot tub, was at a drugstore that night, went in, checked my blood pressure, 126/78. And I thought to myself, you know, we laugh about hypertension. And we think, oh, well, I mean, you know, stress, I can handle that. I didn't realize how, unbeknownst to me, what I was going through at the office had not just a little effect on my blood pressure. It was incredible. Of course, part of it was, you know, preparing for vacation and everything else, but I've never really monitored my blood pressure that much, but it would be fun to see what certain circumstances do to it.
Yeah, well, I recommend in the book that everybody goes to Key West at least once a week. In the stress reduction part, I actually have a whole chapter in there about stress reduction because, as you just said, people don't appreciate what stress is and what stress reduction can do for you. And especially nowadays, I'm like you, I monitor my blood pressure pretty much constantly. And it's just dramatic how I can change it just within an hour's time frame once I put myself into a relaxing situation versus a stressful situation. And that long-term stress that you're subjecting yourself to, that we all do with our jobs nowadays and our commutes, etc., that stress is one of the most harmful things, not only to our bodies in general, but specifically to our brains. Mm-hmm. There's a tremendous amount of data coming out now showing that the hormones that we release chronically during stress actually damage our brain.
My mother's family was one generation away from being Amish. I always call it Amish light. And her theory always was, and of course this will make you think she was somewhat of a procrastinator, don't worry, it'll get done eventually, you know. And friends of mine, and I'm a type A and I'm rushing here and there and I move at the speed of light, but I also don't try to fight the battles I can't win. That was one of the things that I've really, and I want to write a book also, but one of the things in the past 10 years I think that I've learned more than anything else is some things aren't worth fighting. And certainly if you can't change it, don't worry about it. You know, but that's hard to do.
Well, that is hard to do, but that's great advice. You know, I think there's a book out called Don't Sweat the Little Stuff, and it's all little stuff. And, you know, the truth, that is a truth that is just monumental. And if you most of us will admit that. We'll sit back and we'll admit that, you know, the things that we worry about, we really shouldn't be worrying about it. Really, the only thing we need to worry about is our health. And the proof of that is you talk to anybody who's acquired a serious disease, like an age-related disease, and you ask them to put into perspective now what's important in their lives, and they'll say, well, all that other stuff that I thought was important, that means nothing to me now that I have a serious heart disease. And they'll tell you that. But how come we didn't think about that before we got the heart disease?
I hope this isn't too personal a question, but have you ever been in that situation where you think you're dying?
I was just in that situation actually 3.5 years ago.
Well, mine may not have been as serious as yours, but about 5 years ago I had my first and so far only kidney stone. When you're a kid, they don't tell you where the pain is. when I would hear the word kidney stone, I would think that it was when you go to the bathroom. That's when things are going to bother you. I didn't realize, and let me tell people at home, if you get a pain in your backside right at your waist level that feels as if someone has slung a sledgehammer at you, that can be a kidney stone. Well, I'm lying outside waiting for the ambulance in the rain, thinking that everything has ruptured inside of me and that I'm dying. I didn't know. I walk in, the doctor goes, oh, kidney stone, here's a little morphine or whatever they gave, Demerol, I don't know what it was. And the next day I'm fine. But because I did not know what it was I had and assumed that only a preliminary incident to death could cause that much pain, having never gone through childbirth, I thought I was a goner. And they're right. Everything you've ever done goes through your mind quickly. Every mistake I ever made, every person I didn't have time to call on the telephone. It was a really awakening kind of experience. And you're right. Only the really essential, important things came to mind. The stuff I'd worried about an hour before, completely out of my mind at that point. David, remind us the name of the book. You are certainly not an interviewee who every time they open their mouth says, well, in my book called, thank you for not doing that, but I'll give you the chance. At least tell me now what it's called again.
Well, it's called Feel 30 for the next 50 years. And that name was derived from the fact that I really feel, after doing all the work on this book and looking at all the medical literature and being a medical school professor, most of my friends are physicians, I really feel that there's no reason that we have to age poorly. I really think that you can feel young or enhance your youth span, as I call it, that period of your life when you're actually an adult and free of disease, dramatically. There's no reason we can't do that. I tell people that you have to accept the fact that you're going to die. There's no question about that. But you don't have to accept aging. You really don't have to age dramatically. There's so much evidence that that's true, that you can really be healthy right up to the point that something kills you when you're 80 or 90 years old.
You know, if anyone's listening to this who's in their teens or 20s, most young people won't sit still for an interview this long. I will tell you that even though you may feel healthier at that point in your life than you ever will again, you don't yet have the psychological tools, background, or money to really enjoy that yet. And that's one of the great joys of getting older, is that when you finally are able to travel or meet other interesting people, that you're able to combine the ability to be healthy enough with the wherewithal to actually use that youth.
That's an important message. I mean, you want to, when you get older and you have more money and you have children and eventually grandchildren, when you're 20 years old, you don't think that those things are important. But as we all know that have kids, that once you get to be 30, 40, 50, 60 years old, you really do want to stay alive and healthy because you have things to live for, just like you did when you were 20. Those things are different now. And that's a very good message for people to think about, and that's that you should never equate lack of disease with good health. Because you feel good now, you're 20, 30 years old, the processes that will ultimately give you the age-related disease that's going to kill you are now underway. And everybody, they're underway, and your job is to slow them down to the point that you won't get that disease either at all or until well into your 80s or 90s.
If we can look at one thing, and I know neither of us has the statistics in our heads, but I was thinking all of a sudden that 60 now isn't old. 60 was when I was a kid. I wonder if, let's say, right after the Great Depression, where the 60-year-olds were then. I know the life expectancy keeps getting later. I know the average age of the guys who signed the Constitution was 27, But I just wonder, a 40-year-old today, what that feeling, that persona, I'm groping for words here, would have been like, say, 50 years ago. Is today's 40-year-old the 30-year-old of the 40s, or am I asking the question correctly?
Well, two things. This is the way I look at this anyway. I'm very careful when I hear someone talking about average lifespans, because of course averages mean you take the people that die young and the people that die old and you average them together. And right up until recently, we've had a big problem with too many people dying young. The infant death and death in children was much greater until about 30 or 40 years ago. So that dragged the average down. So the average lifespan was much lower at the turn of the century than it is now, because we're preventing those children's death at a much greater rate. So a 40-year-old, in my opinion, if you could get through being a kid back in those days and not die, a 40-year-old 50 years ago, I think, was probably healthier than nowadays, because of the fact they didn't have all these things to assist them in their daily life, so they were getting a lot more exercise. There was a lot less toxins in our environment, and our food was not grown with a lot of nasty stuff as well. So I think that those people are probably healthier.
Yeah, that's a trade-out that I never thought about. The other thing is, you're talking about infant mortality. I didn't realize till I was well into adulthood and was finally sitting down with my mother and her siblings asking about what was it like when they were children, that my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, lost 5 kids who died before the age of 3 at childbirth, 1 at the age of 1, which I guess now they would call infant death syndrome. My Aunt Frida didn't survive beyond 3. She choked to death on a peanut husk. And they went through 5 before they finally got a couple which and then they had 9 after that. But infant mortality was, still it is in some parts of the world, but here in the good old USA until a generation ago was a big problem.
Even in I experienced the same thing in my family, where my mother's mother lost 2 children, and she lost them from colic, which is basically an inflammation of the colon where child's just losing fluids through diarrhea, and that was fatal back then.
You may know this, and I only tell this story once a year, but that the most common cause of death among the pioneers going west was diarrhea.
I didn't know that, but it doesn't
Poorly
surprise me.
processed food, bad water they got. I mean, a gallon of kaopectate would have saved half of the state of Utah. And it's such a simple thing. What about some other common sense things that you talk about in your book that people in their early middle years should start being aware of so that they don't burn the candle at both ends?
Well, one of the things they need to be aware of is there's a tremendous amount of clinical and basic science literature now, medical literature, showing that free radicals play a huge role in the onset of age-related disease.
Dave, if you would explain what that term means exactly.
A free radical is basically a substance in your body. It's usually a molecule that's what's called unstable. Technically, it has either too many or too few electrons, and it wants to either give up an electron or take an electron from another molecule. It's a free radical. It's unstable. So what it'll do is it'll react with a molecule around it, either by taking an electron from that molecule or giving it one. And by doing so, it becomes stable, but it makes that molecule unstable and damaged. Now, we generate these things a lot of different ways, and one of the ways is just through breathing. When you breathe, you actually use molecular oxygen from the air to generate free radicals to make the energy to keep you alive. And it turns out that study after study shows that by doing that, just by virtue of breathing, that probably contributes greatly to our demise ultimately.
See, I'm tempted here to say, what do you want to do then?
Hold your breath.
Yes.
No, there's nothing you can do about that aspect of it. Unfortunately, we are individuals, we are a species that require molecular oxygen to stay alive. The trade-off, as I said, is the generation of free radicals, but what we seem to be able to do with that, and the animal studies are showing this clearly, and the human studies are now starting to show it, is that by taking judicial amounts of certain types of antioxidants, and I'm not talking about taking mega doses either, I'm talking about either taking supplements depending on your diet or eating foods that are higher in antioxidants, it looks like over the long run you're going to greatly alleviate age-related disease by doing that.
I'm glad to hear you not advocate mega dosages, because I've always been leery of people who will trot out an envelope full of pills, that they're taking. I take 6 of these and I got 400,000 milligrams of this, because I don't know. I've always felt that was kind of advocated by the vitamin manufacturers. What are we talking about as far as antioxidants? Are we talking about supplements? Are they present in certain foods?
Yep. Well, what we're talking about is your body is smart enough to know that this is a problem. Your body actually makes substances that are antioxidants because it realizes that it's generating free radicals. You've probably heard of melatonin. That's something your brain makes. Uric acid. There's a few other ones your body makes. And the other thing your body does is it has at least 3 types of enzymes that are designed to squelch or basically eliminate free radicals. But the third thing your body relies on is for you to take in free radicals in your diet. Your body relies on you to do that, and if you don't do that and take them in adequate amounts, that ultimately is harmful for you. Mm-hmm. So your food nowadays, the food that a lot of us eat is very low in antioxidants. A lot of people don't eat adequate amounts of fruits and vegetables, which are the highest in antioxidants. And if you don't do that, and if you can't do that because you just don't like them, then you should be taking supplements. And if you can, because you like fruits and vegetables and because you can afford them because they're expensive, you're much better off getting them through those substances, the foodstuffs that you can acquire from your supermarket.
It's interesting that to some people, what you're advocating, although it is certainly not revolutionary, is a little bit out of the mainstream of what they teach in some medical schools. I mean, we've gotten from a time 100 years ago where the doctor worked with the pharmacist, whom they used to call an apothecary, putting together things which would smack of herbal medicine today before Upjohn and Lilly did the same thing and called it pills, into an era where, as you said at the very beginning, we prescribe in retrospect. Do you find that there is still a part of the medical establishment which really can't understand diet, which isn't programmed to look at anything other than really cut and dried traditional treatments for things? Because you're not radical at all, but yet in some people's eyes you are.
Well, I certainly am not radical at all, and the problem is there's two types of doctors, and as I said, most of my friends are physicians. I know a lot of doctors, and I find personally the ones that I know, the majority of them know that this stuff is real. There's something more to medicine than detecting existing disease and treating it with pharmaceutical drugs. The reality is, especially with HMOs nowadays, that physicians don't have the time to research this medical literature. If it doesn't appear in a Journal of the American Medical Association or New England Journal of Medicine, they don't see it. And if it's not there, they don't think it's real. But the reality of the situation is that there is definitely something to this stuff, and it's definitely a large amount of clinical information available on it. Physicians need to realize that the medications that they so easily will prescribe for a patient for certain diseases are in fact synthetic derivatives of naturally occurring substances almost all the time. You can't patent naturally occurring substances, so pharmaceutical companies have no interest in those. And they'll take that substance naturally occurring that we know works in a beneficial way, tweak a molecule here and there so that it's synthetic, patent it, and then do the clinical studies that cost $600 million and then sell it for a huge profit.
So what do you do if you have a doctor, albeit he or she's a nice guy, gal, but they just, A, are too busy. Secondly, you don't feel they're really talking to you. I mean, I know myself that in talking to people such as yourself and doctors, that one of the real problems we have, for 3 or 4 reasons, is that there's not a lot of communication between doctor and patient. It's not as bad in some Asian cultures where there was such a modesty thing that you would put a little pin in a doll to show a person where you hurt because you didn't want the doctor touching them, But we just seem to have this McDonald's type thing where you walk in, the doctor looks at you, it fits a common format, he writes a script for you, leave. Should you be timid about saying to the doctor, hey, look, don't get up yet, I want to talk about this? How do you find a doctor who will talk to you? How do you find a doctor who's into understanding what you've been talking about, particularly if you're in a small town? What do you do?
Well, one of the things that you can do is I belong to an academy called the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. They actually publish a yearbook. There's thousands of doctors that belong to this academy, and these doctors are more interested in preventing disease than treating existing disease, and they actually produce a yearbook with the names of these doctors that people can, if you go onto the internet and just...
I was going to ask about that. I'm sure they're there.
Look for the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. That's one thing. Another thing to do is check with your state. Your state usually always will have some kind of department of health care, and find out if they have people that are listed there that practice what is called alternative medicine. I don't really like that name. Complementary medicine is better. Because if you're going to your physician, and your physician is seeing you in less than 15 minutes and getting you out, then you need to get another doc. That's the major problem with this country. With HMOs now, your physician is put under that pressure where they have to get you out of there in 15 minutes.
My guest is Dave Johnson. He has written a wonderful new book about staying and looking 30 until we're in our 50s. He should know he teaches every day in Boston at one of the big medical colleges there. Dave, during the break, we were talking about HMOs. Could you restate here on the air what you see as the problem with health maintenance organizations?
The way the HMO works in a nutshell is that the HMO will send your physician, thousands of patients and pay your physician a certain amount, $6, $7, $10 per patient. So you take all these patients and we'll give you this amount of money. Your physician's losing money if you come to see him more than once. So you're put in a position where your physician's hoping you're not going to come and see him or her, and that you don't get sick. And when you do, because they also get a check every 3 months or so based on how many people they refer out or how many tests they order, the more tests that they order and unnecessary tests in the opinion of the HMO or referrals that they make, the less money they get. So you're dealing with a doctor who unfortunately doesn't want to do any more for you than he or she absolutely has to.
Yeah, it's a sad situation. Dave, we have only a few minutes left. Let's go back and recap some of the things we've talked about. You, in your book, very basically say that there's no reason why, when 30 comes around, that 10 years later you have to feel and look 40. That there are things you can do to slow down the aging process that are common sense kind of thing. Diet?
Absolutely.
Want to go through that again?
Well, there's two aspects of diet that people need to be aware of. First of all is the total number of calories you consume. To this day, there's nothing in any medical literature that's more tried and true as far as keeping an animal healthy than a restricted, total calorie restricted diet. In other words, you don't restrict the calories in the diet to the point where the animal's losing weight, but the animal's only supplied with enough calories to keep it going and functioning normally and no extra calories. That absolutely is one of the most dramatic things that we see in medicine in animal models, and there's no reason to believe it doesn't occur in humans, and there's preliminary evidence to suggest it does. So the lesson coming from that is, even if you're one of these people that seems to be able to eat a lot and you don't get fat, you're still doing yourself a great disservice by eating excessive amounts of calories. And I show people how to calculate the calories that they need in the book. The second thing is what those calories are comprised of. We all know about fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And this country's been on a fat-free phase for what now, 5 years, where everybody thinks, well, it's fat-free, it's okay to eat it. The fact of the matter is fat isn't bad for you. Saturated fat is bad for you, but unsaturated fat is absolutely required by your body.
You know, I never could figure out that whole thing about fat. I mean, you hear people talking about cholesterol, and there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, and good fat and bad fat. It would seem that the average person gets bombarded by so many things in the media, so many things they read. I mean, you ever read the back of a package of cereal? It's hard to know whether to eat or drink anything or not.
People will look at a box of cookies that say fat-free, and they think, well, it's calorie-free, and they eat the whole box. And that's why we're fatter than ever.
Dave, thanks for coming here from Boston to talk to us. Health is always a very important and an interesting subject. The name of the book again?
The name of the book is Fuel 30 for the Next 50 Years.
Hope we can.
Hope we can, too.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Look 30 until you're 50. Well, I think I'm about 20 years too late for that. I'm Dennis Staley.